Welcome to the Battle of the Presidents, where we will learn about the first 5 presidents and then decide who is best. I'm Mr. Klein here with Mr. Mitchell, and we'll be walking through the presidency of James Monroe in this episode. James Monroe was an American statesman, lawyer, diplomat, and founding father who served as the 5th president of the United States from 1817 to 1825. A member of the Democratic-Republican Party, Monroe was the last president of the Virginia dynasty. His presidency coincided with the era of good feelings. He is perhaps best known for issuing the Monroe Doctrine. He also served as governor of Virginia, a member of the United States Senate, the U.S. ambassador to France and Britain, the 7th Secretary of State, and the 8th Secretary of War. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Dude, chill!
As soon as Monroe was elected as president in 1816, he was off to work immediately. One of the first things he does is send U.S. troops to secure the U.S.-Florida border, led by General Andrew Jackson. At the same time, conflicts arose between the United States and the Seminole Indians in Florida. The Seminole often helped runaway slaves and sometimes raided U.S. settlements. In April 1818, Jackson's troops invaded Florida to capture Seminole raiders. This act began the First Seminole War. During the war, Jackson took over most of Spain's important military posts. Then he overthrew the governor of Florida, and he carried out these acts against Spain without receiving direct orders from President Monroe. Jackson's actions upset Spanish leaders. Most Americans, however, supported Jackson.
Well, I guess I'm in charge now.
Jackson's presence in Florida convinced Spanish leaders to negotiate. In 1819, the two countries signed the Onis Treaty, which settled all border disputes between Spain and the United States. Under this treaty, Spain gave East Florida to the United States. In return, the United States gave up its claims to what is now Texas. U.S. leaders also agreed to pay up to $5 million of U.S. citizens' claims against Spain.
Meanwhile, Spain had other problems. By the early 1820s, most of the Spanish colonies in the Americas had declared independence. Revolutionary fighter Simón Bolívar, called the Liberator, led many of these struggles for independence. The political circumstances surrounding the revolutions reminded most American leaders of the American Revolutionary War. As a result, they supported these struggles. After Mexico broke free from Spain in 1821, President Monroe grew worried. He feared that rival European powers might try to take control of newly independent Latin American countries. He was also concerned about Russia's interest in the northwest coast of North America.
Secretary of State John Quincy Adams shared President Monroe's concerns. In a 4th of July speech before Congress, Adams said that the United States had always been friendly with European powers and that the country did not want to be involved in wars with them. He implied that he supported the newly independent countries, but said the United States would not fight their battles.
Great Britain was also interested in restraining the influence of other European nations in the Americas. This was because Britain had formed close trading ties with most of the independent Latin American countries. Britain wanted to issue a joint statement with the United States to warn the rest of Europe not to interfere with Latin America. Instead, Secretary of State Adams and President Monroe decided to put together a document protecting American interest. The Monroe Doctrine was an exclusive statement of American policy warning European powers not to interfere with the Americas. The doctrine was issued by the President on December 2, 1823, during his annual message to Congress.
The Monroe Doctrine has 4 basic points. 1. The United States would not interfere with the affairs of European nations. 2. The United States would recognize and not interfere with colonies that already existed in North and South America. 3. The Western Hemisphere was to be off limits to future colonization by any foreign power. And the 4th, the United States government would consider any European power's attempt to colonize or interfere with the nations in the Western Hemisphere to be a hostile act.
Some Europeans strongly criticized the Monroe Doctrine, but few European countries challenged it. The doctrine had remained important to U.S. foreign policy. The United States has continued to consider Latin America within its sphere of influence, the area a nation claims some control over. At times, it has intervened in Latin American affairs when its own interests, such as national security, were at risk.
Pleased by successful negotiations with foreign powers, Americans enjoy a rising sense of nationalism. Nationalism is a feeling of pride or loyalty to a nation.
These colors don't run.
This new national unity found a strong supporter in U.S. Representative Henry Clay, from Kentucky. Clay believed that a strong national economy would promote national feeling and reduce regional conflicts. He developed a plan that came to be known as the American System, a series of measures intended to make the United States economically self-sufficient. To build the economy, he pushed for a national bank that would provide a single currency, making interstate trade easier. Clay wanted the money from a protective tariff to be used to improve roads and canals. These internal improvements would unite the country.
Some members of Congress believed that the Constitution did not permit the federal government to spend money on internal improvements. Clay argued that the possible gains for the country justified federal action. In the early 1800s, most roads in the United States were made of dirt, making travel difficult. British actress Frances Kimball describes one New York road she had struggled along during a visit in the 1830s. Quote, "The wickedest road, I do think, the cruelest hard-heartedness just road that ever I will rumble upon." End quote.
I waste time, say lot word when few word do trick.
To improve the nation's roads, Congress agreed with Clay and invested in road building. The Cumberland Road was the first road built by the federal government. It ran from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, a town on the Ohio River in present-day West Virginia. Construction began in around 1815. Workers had to cut a 66-foot wide band, sometimes through forests, to make way for the road. Then they had to use shovels and pickaxes to dig a 12 to 18-inch roadbed, which they filled with crushed stone. All of the work had to be done without the benefit of today's bulldozers and steamrollers.
By 1818, the road reached Wheeling. By 1833, the National Road, as the expansion was called, stretched to Columbus, Ohio. And by 1850, it reached all the way to Illinois. Meanwhile, Americans tried to make water transportation easier by building canals. One of the largest projects was the Erie Canal, which ran from Albany to Buffalo, New York. Construction of the canal began in 1817 and was completed in 1825. Using shovels, British, German, and Irish immigrants dug the entire canal by hand. The canal cost millions of dollars, but it proved to be worth the expense. The Erie Canal allowed goods and people to move between towns on Lake Erie to New York City and even the East Coast. Its success served as an incentive for a canal building boom across the country.
From 1815 to 1825, the United States enjoyed the era of good feelings, an era of peace, pride, and progress. The phrase was coined by a Boston editor in 1817 during James Monroe's visit to New England early in his presidency. The emphasis on national unity was strengthened by the Supreme Court case decisions that reinforced the power of the federal government. In the 1819 case McCulloch v. Maryland, the court asserted the implied powers of Congress in allowing for the creation of a national bank. In the 1824 case Gibbons v. Ogden, the court said that the states could not interfere with the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce.
Even during the era of good feelings, disagreements between the different regions, known as sectionalism, threatened the Union. One such disagreement arose in 1819 when Congress considered Missouri's application to enter the Union as a slave state. At the time, the Union had 11 free states and 11 slave states. Adding a new slave state would have tipped the balance in the Senate in favor of the South.
To protect the power of the free states, the House passed a special amendment. It declared that the United States would accept Missouri as a slave state, but importing enslaved Africans into Missouri would be illegal. The amendment also set free the children of Missouri slaves. Southern politicians angrily opposed this plan. This amendment was eventually rejected by the Senate, and Missouri was still not a state.
Henry Clay convinced Congress to agree to the Missouri Compromise, which settled the conflict that had arisen from Missouri's application for statehood. This compromise had three main conditions. 1. Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state. 2. Maine would join the Union as a free state, keeping the number of slave and free states equal. And 3. Slavery would be prohibited in any new territories or states formed north of the 3630 latitude line, Missouri's southern border. Congress passed the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Despite the success of the compromise, there were still strong disagreements between the North and South over the expansion of slavery.
Those are the highlights of the major events that took place while Monroe was president. His presidency was filled with things from the gaining of Florida, the Monroe Doctrine, the American System, and the Missouri Compromise. So where do you think that Monroe stacks up against the other presidents? Now that you've watched all 5 episodes, which president do you think won the Battle of the Presidents? Who was the best? Who was the worst? What can we learn from each of these presidencies? Thank you for joining us on Battle of the Presidents.